Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us once again as we discuss politics of Latin America and the Caribbean. This week, we're looking at patterns of development across Latin America with a look at the development of the political economy. With that, we will be basically talking about what were some of the major strategies that were used across Latin American and Caribbean countries to enhance development or lead to development. So we look at, first of all, defining what are some of the major key terms, like what's development, how do they use things such as populism, corporatism. We're going to define what is import substitution, industrialization, export-oriented industrialization, neoliberalism, and its associated strategies of structural adjustment programs and the Washington Consensus. What role does globalization and even regional integration play in development efforts across the region? And of course, we'll talk about the major theories that are used to try to explain development or underdevelopment across Latin America and the Caribbean. With that, once we define these particular terms, we look at the history of Latin American political economy, keeping these theories and concepts in mind and how it is that they were used to ensure development, as well as how it is that many of these states really still experience underdevelopment even with using these strategies. I will end by discussing what the future of Latin American development may look like. So first, what do we mean by development? Now, we know that development is a broad, contested concept. At its core, it refers to improvements in a country's economic and social conditions, including how it manages natural and human resources. It is said to be both quantitative, meaning that we can measure it based on growth, income, and even production in a country, as well as it's also qualitative, that it can be measured by looking at living standards, levels of education or access to education, same thing with health, and what is the political capacity of that country like. So because of this, we know that there are different forms or ways in which we can look at development. You can look at it from the economic point of view, which is basically the quantitative discussion we had before, which is growth, income, or production. Looking at it from the point of view of human development, which is basically looking at living standards, access to education, and health. We can look at it from social development, which is meaning how a society changed over time. Political development, looking at the political capacity and the organizations, political organizations used to govern that country. Or we can look at it from the perspective of sustainable development. How is it that one generation uses its resources, how this would affect future generations? So with that, we know that development is not just growth, but it's about how growth affects people. Now, when we look at other political strategies of development, we'll first talk about populism. Now, populism simply, when looking at it in the Latin American perspective, it was largely associated with charismatic leaders and the use of or the inclusion of mass political participation with a focus on nationalism, and it really tended to bypass traditional elites and institutions that tended to be very undemocratic and just focus on themselves as opposed to everybody within society. So you found that, there's usually the development of populist coalitions to try to push for development that would lead to a change in how the economic and social conditions would affect the masses. But we found that this push tended to be from the urban working class that was missing out on all of these things prior to that. But even though it worked in some cases, you found that some of these coalitions, once they developed, were usually very ideologically diverse and sometimes very unstable. Now, when we look at corporatism, which Latin America is really known for, particularly when we look at Mexico, for 70 years prior to full democracy in the early 21st century, we know that corporatism tends to refer to a system where the state organizes and controls major social groups, that is labor, business, and professional associations, into a hierarchical state sanctioned bodies. So every organization has a role to play in this bigger moving cog. Of course, it's really built a lot on the Iberian and Catholic traditions, and you found that the corporatist approach to development was all about order, hierarchy, everybody knowing their place, and the focus was on state authority over pluralism. So it wasn't about having what we call all groups seen on an equal level where they work together for development is that everybody has a role. They have a hierarchy: who is most important, least important, and the state is the final authority in where development would go. Now, when we look at these two forms, or these two political forms, they actually shaped how economic development strategies were actually implemented and controlled across the region. The next is, we saw that the region used what we call competing development strategy. The earliest one that was used was import substitution industrialization. Now, ISI, import substitution industrialization, or ISI, was really aimed at reducing dependence on imports by countries producing manufactured goods domestically. They'd use tariffs, quotas, and state protection to help to build these industries and allow for there to be inward manufacturing and development, and the building of labor. You found that the countries that experienced greater success or early success using import substitution industrialization were countries like Brazil and Mexico, and to a lesser extent we saw Chile and Argentina doing very well. Right? They did well until around the 1970s, where we saw ISI faltering due to inefficiency, corruption, weak exports, inequality, and even underemployment happening in these countries. When ISI starts to falter, the shift moved towards export-oriented industrialization. Now, export-oriented industrialization is focused on producing goods and services for the global market. So it was all about emphasizing comparative advantage, meaning that if there was an industry that the country thought that they would have some future comparative advantages where they could produce this good relatively cheap to other countries, they protect that industry so that it would grow, so that they could actually see greater profit, greater production coming from said industry. So it's all about what can we produce at a relatively, cheaper way that we could make more money. It was focused on having foreign investment coming in to lead to this happening as well. And it's how can we get our country more integrated into the world economy. So we saw across Latin America and the Caribbean by the 70s, mainly in the 1980s, as we've tried to use the strategy, it actually expanded manufacturing and exports across the region. However, it also increased the region's foreign dependence, and it also displaced local producers in some sectors. So we saw that these two main production competing development strategies, with ISI, it tended to emphasize autonomy, and with EOI, it was emphasizing integration, and we saw that both of these strategies provided mixed outcomes across Latin America and the Caribbean. Now we're going to look at the trio of neoliberalism, structural adjustment programs, and the Washington Consensus. Now, by the 1980s onwards, we know that Latin America adopted neoliberal reforms, and this is really under the pressure from international organizations, right, after they faced a lot of issues with the debt crisis and the world economy faltering in the 1970s. So because they couldn't borrow from traditional banks, they turned to international organizations such as the IMF, the World Bank, and even the Inter-American Development Bank that focuses on Latin America and the Caribbean region. So these neoliberal reforms tended to focus on the idea of having unregulated, unfettered free markets, that the government should reduce public spending, that they should privatize any industries that the government had any control over, because again, they said that this would be better for the country. So they actually did this through these structural adjustment programs that these IOs provided, and the bigger picture is known as the Washington Consensus. So these reforms, or the neoliberal reforms, included what we'd call privatization, deregulation, austerity, which is mean tightening the belt so you're not spending too much in the public purse. It was also focused on trade liberalization, meaning opening up your markets to goods and you trying to export as much goods as possible, and that they should practice fiscal discipline. Now, one thing that we should note about the Washington Consensus, the use of structural adjustment programs and having these neoliberal reforms is that it did allow for the stabilization of inflation across Latin America and the Caribbean. It did restore some growth in the region after the major Latin American debt crisis of the 70s and 80s, right? However, one downfall was that it increased unemployment across the region. It led to informal labor, so people weren't going into the traditional industries. They were, improvising and doing some ways, working on the black market in a way. And we also saw that it led to an increase in inequality, thus also weakening the social safety net, right? That would help to protect most of the citizens. So when we look at neoliberalism in association with the structural adjustment program and Washington Consensus that pushed it, is that it stabilized economies, but it imposed high social costs on Latin American and Caribbean countries. When we look at what were the theories now in trying to understand, development and underdevelopment across the region, there were two main schools of thought. You had the modernization theory and the dependency theory. Now, the modernization theory is the earliest theory in trying to understand development in the global north and the global south. Now, their main argument, because it's most dominant in the 1940s and 1960s, was that countries experience underdevelopment due to their own internal social and cultural factors, and that if societies want to experience development, they had to follow this linear path, moving away from a traditional society to a modern society, right? In a way that they would become more entrepreneurial. Like if you move away from traditional to modern societies, all good things would come together. You just have to follow the examples of what they saw happening in the developed world, that they experienced development. You just had to move away from traditional to modern society and all good things would come. You'd see industrialization happening. You'd see increased wealth, increased education, increased democracy, and this would all happen in a linear fashion, right? You'd find that if they didn't abandon this traditional society, that you'd find that this would in itself lead to underdevelopment. And for countries of Latin America and the Caribbean and other global south countries, whether it's in Africa and Asia, they're saying that for these countries to experience development, they needed to have westernized elites that were schooled in the global north, trained in secular, bureaucratic, and entrepreneurial values, coming back to their countries, leading their countries into the modernized age. That this is what would lead to development of these countries. On the other end, we had the dependency school that was more dominant from the 1960s onwards, when it was that they're seeing that these countries weren't experiencing full development, but underdevelopment. And if I just realized I didn't define what underdevelopment is. Underdevelopment is slow, chronically low growth, right? And they still saw a lot of these countries experiencing it. So the dependency theory said, okay, modernization theory is too Western in its point of view, and it's missing some of the reasons why underdevelopment has occurred in Latin America and the Caribbean and other global south countries. Now, the dependency school, which is rooted in Marxism, rejected the modernization theorist's position. And they argued that Latin America's underdevelopment was actually a result of historical exploitation and unequal global relationships. So it's not anything to do with any internal social or cultural factors, but it had more to do with how former colonial masters had shaped these countries, and how it is that you found that those that were in the global north or in the core extracted resources from the periphery, which are countries in the global south, which include Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia. Them extracting these surpluses would have led to the global north experiencing development and the global south not having these same resources necessary for their own development. So they're saying that it's not the fault of Latin America and the Caribbean. Why it is that we saw them experiencing low, chronic, slow development. So in their position, you had authors such as Raul Prebesh, which is said to be from the Latin Dependencia school, where he focused on looking at development in Latin America. And then we had Andre Gunda Frank that noted that, when you look at the terms of trade, that the Latin America would always be in perpetual poverty, meaning they're the ones that would be exporting primary products and importing manufactured goods from the global north that is more expensive. So because primary goods are cheaper than manufactured goods, no matter how much primary goods Latin America and the Caribbean would sell, they'd never make the same amount of money as they need to buy the manufactured goods. So there'd always be low growth and underdevelopment. And of course, we do see the structural dependence because of how the world economy is developed. So that's the argument that came from the school. So when you look at these two theories, development and underdevelopment, they argue it was largely an interconnected process. They're not separate stages. And as I think Andre Gunder Frank says, development and underdevelopment are two sides of the same coin, which is something that's very interesting. Now, when we look at the historical patterns, the timeline of Latin American, the development of the Latin American economy or the political economy, is that you found that from colonial times onwards, Latin America was integrated into the global system as a primary exporting region that specialized in monocrops like coffee, sugar, bananas, oil, and minerals. And as a result of this basically led to the development of monocrop economies, where you'd have an economy that's just focused on just largely producing maybe just coffee, largely just producing bananas. We saw these things developing across the region. We also found that there was also extreme vulnerability to price fluctuations because of this. By extension, because of a lot of there being these monocrop economies, we saw foreign dominated enclave production. So you had major MNCs like United Fruit coming into places like Guatemala, and their focus was largely on just the banana production. So you had these very large multinational corporations that were running the different industries across the region. So that was one of the things that we saw developing. You saw there's this deep inequality in land ownership between the latifundos and the minifundos, meaning you had these few traditional elites that own large lands, and then you had a very small number of small landowners at many of the times, because of the fact that they didn't have a lot of capital to help to develop their small farms. They ended up being in a lot of debt and had to sell their labor to these large latifundos, haciendas that made up much of agrarian production in Latin America in the 20th century. So they couldn't compete with these large landowners. So you saw how it kind of led to the reduction of small landowners to just a focus on the small number of traditional rich elites that owned properties. By extension, as I mentioned before, you did see foreign corporations coming in, exercising enormous economic and political power. And a major example I just gave a while ago was the United Fruit Company, right? That was the largest producer and exporter of bananas in Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica and Panama. That they were able to suppress a lot of union activities. They were able to have a lot of power over local government, and they had the US backing in how it is that they had this influence over these economies. So, the CIA would have, for example, organized a coup against the Guatemala constitutional government in 1954 because of the United Fruit Company's pressure on the US government to do something to stop any expropriation of any unused lands that they had in Guatemala. So when we look at it, the debt crisis is something that has affected this region a great deal, right? In the 1970s, we saw a downturn happening right across the world. And, any kind of, development that occurred on the ISI, on the other means that Latin America and the Caribbean was using, started to falter. It started to falter. So you found that the 1970s oil shock increasing interest rates actually triggered the Latin American debt crisis that ended any easy access to credit. What followed was that there was some IMF imposed structural adjustment that marked a decisive shift away from state-led development towards market-oriented reforms. And we found that the debt crisis redefined development priorities around fiscal stability rather than social welfare across the region. So that was a major thing that we saw as an impact of the oil crisis in the 70s that led to the Latin American debt crisis, that the focus is just on stability rather than focusing on the social welfare of the citizenry. As we saw Latin American and Caribbean becoming more integrated into the global market, you found that there was this nice, mix of how do Latin American and Caribbean countries use regional integration in this more globalized world that they have to participate in global markets. What you found then, in order for them to participate better in global markets, Latin America pursued regional integration through organizations like Mercosur and ALBA, and even earlier efforts such as LAFTA and the Andean PAC as a means by which to lower tariffs, lower any kind of barriers to trade within these Latin American countries, that they could increase their production, increase their comparative advantage, so that once they go out to the global level, they're better able to trade. You saw those things happening. I mean, there was also the proposed FTAA, which is a free trade area of the Americas that George Bush Sr. was trying to push, to have the entire region from Canada all the way to Argentina and Chile being in this one area where to remove tariffs that would allow for this to also occur. However, it never came to fruition. So far, we have NAFTA, which is now the USMCA, that was really a market deeper form of integration with the US with the US and Canada and Mexico. But we're seeing that for Mexico, with this trade area between these three countries, that the benefits for Mexico has actually been uneven and even controversial. So in trying to push for integration, if you want to just use just NAFTA as an example, we've seen across the region where integrations actually helped to expand trade, whether through Mercosur, ALBA, CARICOM, which is in the Caribbean itself. It has increased and expanded trade, but it has not eliminated any inequality or dependence that we've seen occurring across the region. Now, what about the legacy, of these types of economies since the colonial age, and what does the 21st century prospects look like? We know that by the 21st century, many Latin American economies experience growth driven by high commodity prices. And in some cases, they even implemented some progressive social policies. However, as a legacy, these are some of the things that still remain. Inequality remains severe. Economies are still commodity dependent. It's all about mainly those monocrops, those primary goods. They're still largely dependent on those types of industries. You find that competition from Asia is threatening the manufacturing industries here in Latin America, because again, in some instances, Asia is able to produce certain goods and services cheaper than Latin America, so it's actually threatening manufacturing in Latin America. And the decision has been, if we want to see our prospects in Latin America improving in the 21st century, that there needs to be a focus on long-term development, which in itself is going to require diversification of our industries. Can't be focusing just on a monocrop or just few goods and services. We have to kind of diversify. We have to improve education and access to education across the region. We have to invest in healthcare. That's a major thing, because again, if you have a healthy labor force, that in itself would actually lead to improved contributions to development. And there's this idea that we also have to focus on poverty reduction in each country in Latin America and the Caribbean, so that we could actually experience true development. With that said, when we look at the Latin American economy, political economy and development across Latin America and the Caribbean, the path in this respect, reflects a constant tension between autonomy and dependence, with shifting strategies from ISI to EOI to neoliberalism, which is the focus has been on producing growth, but it's consistently reproduced inequality rooted in historical structures. I want to thank you.